Hi everyone. Today we're going to finish the section on dependency theory. If you don't understand some of this material, that's probably because you need to see the recorded lecture previous to this one, the live session that we had on Wednesday. Anyway, so I am going to start sharing my screen so I can pick up where I left on Wednesday. So the question for this section was, okay, tell us, how is that rich nations actually exploit poor nations? How is that the center countries exploit the underdeveloped periphery? So on Wednesday, I start talking about the importance of multinational corporations. I said that one way they exploit is by practicing what we call profit repatriation, which is highlighted in yellow on the screen. So the idea is that multinational corporations have presence in different countries. So when they have a presence in a poor economy, like Bolivia or Ecuador or Haiti, well, they make money in these countries, but they don't reinvest the profits they make. They ship them back to whatever host country, whatever the headquarters of the company are located. Could be Germany, could be the US, could be Canada, right? And this is important because if production was taking place, was produced by domestic companies, not international multinational corporations, but domestic industries, more likely all these profits would be reinvested in the country, not repatriated elsewhere. So this represents a leakage of resources. And of course, with that, the economic base, the income that circulates in the economy is reduced. So the tax base is reduced. And of course, that produces problems. The second element that I explained was the decline in terms of trade. So I am not going to explain this again because I already did on Wednesday. But I'm talking about this part right here, the decline in terms of trade. So that's where I talk about the TT and the ratio of prices. So the basic idea of this decline in terms of trade is that because the price of raw materials are decreasing or is decreasing relative to the price of manufactured, highly technologically advanced goods, poor countries that specialize in the production and exports of raw materials have to produce and export an increasing amount over time in order to buy the manufactured, highly technological goods from rich nations. So I think the example I gave on Wednesday was of Costa Rica producing bananas or oranges. So if my example doesn't match, forgive me, I forget. But I think I used the example of 1 metric ton of bananas in order to buy one car. So Costa Rica produces 1 metric ton of bananas in exchange of one car from the US. But now the price of bananas relative to the price of cars is falling, right? So now Costa Rica has to produce a larger amount of bananas, maybe not 1 metric tons, but 2 metric tons of bananas in order to buy the same car. And this has been going on over time. So the price disparity has been growing and growing and growing over time. So many developing countries, Costa Rica, Bolivia, many Latin American economies are saying, hey, this is such a bad deal. We're getting screwed because, the terms of trade are declining. And well, obviously, that produces a lot of significant issues for these countries. Now, here is another one that for some reason I did not put on your notes. So I am going to stop this for a second because I want to use my whiteboard. Okay. So the next concept is something that, hold on. I want to draw right here. It's called Why is not working? Let me do it this way. Draw right here. It's called race. I'm not using my pen, I'm using my finger because race to the, oh, this is like, I feel like a kindergartner. I don't know what's going on. To the bottom. Anyway, race to the bottom. So here is the basic concept, guys. So think about a race to the bottom the following way. Poor countries have to compete among themselves in order to attract multinational corporations, in order to attract capital, in order to attract investment, right? Actually, I don't need this, so I am going to actually stop sharing so you can see me. So the idea is that, let's suppose that Mexico is offering Volkswagen, the example I gave before, tax incentives. So for example, Mexico says, okay, Volkswagen 40, 50 years ago, whenever they moved to Mexico, if you move to my country, I'm going to give you these tax exemptions. So if you, normally we charge for capital investment, this tax, profits taxed. Well, we are going to forgive that if you come to our country. Oh, okay, that's a good deal. But then Costa Rica may say, well, we can match that and something more. In addition to not charging the taxes, we are going to relax our environmental standards. Oh, what do you mean? Well, you know, if you have to, you know, release some chemicals into the air, and normally that's not allowed in this country, well, we may make an exception. Oh, really? Yeah, of course, of course. And then Bolivia may say, well, guess what? What Mexico offers and what Costa Rica offers is not enough, because in addition to that, I'm going to give you something else. We are going to relax safety standards. So don't worry, workers don't have to wear helmets, you don't have to provide social security, any of those things, you know? So what I'm talking about is that this competition to attract foreign investment is driving the standards down. And this is what we call a race to the bottom in order to secure financial investments from other countries. So this is not good, because I'm sure you have seen in many other classes and in many other documentaries how multinational corporations are using, you know, places in Latin America, in Asia, to literally dump chemicals because the environmental standards were relaxed, or how they abuse child labor or labor period by, you know, exploiting them, working 14, 16 hours a day in really awful conditions. Those type of things are the result of the race to the bottom effect. So again, this is another way dependency theory argues this shouldn't be happening, guys. This is a bad deal. Anyway, let me go back to my screen here. Now, in addition to these effects by multinational corporations, and remember, I already mentioned three: profit repatriation, declining terms of trade, and number three is the race to the bottom. We actually, just so that you don't forget, let me add it here. So race to the bottom. That's number three, right? Very, very important, guys. Anyway, in addition to these three, we have other distortions. So, for example, most of the times when multinational corporations go and invest in poor developing economies, they bring technology that we say is capital intensive, or in other words, labor saving technology, or in other words, is the type of investment that instead of increasing employment, they reduce employment. Why? Well, think about mechanization, robotization. So, you know, a machine can do the job of 20 workers and you only need one engineer, right? So this new technology is fantastic because it's faster, it's more efficient, it's more productive, it's quieter, whatever. All of these benefits of technology. But the problem in many cases is that the demand for skilled labor, engineers, scientists, technicians, increases relative to the unskilled labor, people with high school degrees or lower than that, which is abundant in the first place in poor countries. So guess what? You are saving 20 unskilled workers with 1 or 2 skilled workers. But not only that, in addition to this unemployment being created by this investment in these new technologies, the 2 or 3 engineers and technicians are going to be making a lot more money than the others that now are unemployed. So the point is that in addition to potentially increasing unemployment, more people with no jobs, the investment by multinational corporations can increase the inequality in terms of income. So it can make distribution of income worse. And then you can also argue other things like, consumer taste and consumerism. Let me tell you this story that is actually, I don't know, interesting, so to speak. A few years ago, they were interviewing Fidel Castro, now dead, of course, the former president of Cuba. And apparently he was really upset with the press at the time because they were talking about precisely this, how the US had been expanding through marketing and promotion of American interest, consumption and things that in the mind of Fidel Castro were of no value, right? So he says, hey, if you take any kid in Latin America, a random kid in Latin America, very few, unfortunately, and this is Fidel Castro upset, very few are going to know who Simón Bolívar was. So Simón Bolívar, or Simon Bolívar, is the equivalent of George Washington for the US, the movement of independence. Simón Bolívar, was the liberator of not one country, but 3 countries, right? So Venezuela and other countries in South America. The point is that Fidel Castro said, okay, if we are lucky, a few children are going to know who Simón Bolívar was. But if you ask the same kid who Mickey Mouse is, everybody knows that is this mouse with the ears and all that. That's not possible. And, so the point of this story is that many people in dependency theory argues that the expansion of economic interest and political interest have cultural ramifications that are not necessarily in the best interest in the best interest of the hosting countries, the poor countries, right? And then the final part right here is, the integration. And I already mentioned this. So multinational corporations are tied to the mother country. Typically, they bring labor, qualified labor, the CEO, but they also are bringing parts and technology. They don't develop really a domestic industry in the country that is hosting them. So there are no ties with the local economy, no room for growth and expansion, no multiplier effects. Very few of that happens. And again, in the mind of dependency theory, that's another way rich countries can exploit poor countries. And then we talked about briefly last time about political distortions that basically multinational corporations, in some cases, in some countries, are able to attain such economic power that can transfer that or transform that into political power. So like in the example of the Volkswagen, sometimes in Mexico, for example, they are able to influence electoral processes, who the new mayor is going to be in the city, who the new governor in the state is going to be. And of course, if they see a particular policy or regulation that is going to be against the interests of Volkswagen, well, they have an army of ways and people to, well, make sure that doesn't happen, right? Anyway, so these are a few of the arguments, a few of the ways they explain rich nations exploit poor nations in this dependency theory argument. All right. Normally at this point, I make a pause and I ask if you have questions, but obviously you are not here. Well, you are, but not when I'm recording. Anyway, so I'll have to keep going. Central propositions. This is just a summary, all right? And I am not going to repeat what is written. I'm just going to highlight a few points. Number one, underdevelopment is not the same as undevelopment. This goes to the point of, you know, developing countries are not developed countries in the making. No. Underdeveloped means you are not using your resources well. And you probably won't until you change something or a few things, right? Now, number two, this is important because contrary to what Rostow proposed, that development was a historical process and all poor nations had to do here was to follow the footprint of what rich nations have done in order to catch up. No. Dependency theory says, no. These countries are not behind. They are not catching up. No. They are poor because rich nations are making them poor, right? And then we can talk about the historical reasons for that. For example, if we think about England, if we think about Spain, they became huge empires and very powerful countries because they had colonies. They exploit for centuries. You know, in the case of Spain and Portugal, they exploit Latin America for 3 centuries, and that's how they end up in the place they are now, right? I mean, there is one reason why you find all these castles in Europe, right? And all this gold and all this wealth. Well, if what Rostow is talking about was true, well, we would need, you know, Bolivia or Ecuador to have other colonies or other countries to colonize in order to become the next Spain or the next England. But there are no other places to conquer. You know, the British, for example, already conquered Africa and Asia. You know, it's like the historical context is totally different. There is no way to compare this, right? So, no, according to dependency theory, not catching up, they are not behind, they are poor because rich countries are making them poor. Number 3, so dependency theory suggests that some alternative uses of resources would be better rather than the use of resources imposed by, well, center countries, right? So the example is this, you know, how do you explain that places like Africa are exporting rice or they are exporting food in general when people in Africa are dying of famine? Like, that doesn't make any sense, right? So, or you know, that they are, African countries are exporting wood and other raw materials where they don't have homes to live for many people in Africa, right? That doesn't make any sense. And well, dependency theory argues that we should figure out what would be the best use of resources to satisfy the internal domestic needs, and then talk about how to export. So the idea is to produce, to meet the needs internally, and then if there is an excess, then you can sell it, right? The problem, number 4, the problem is that for this there is this need to define what a national economic interest is in the first place. So what is the meaning of this is best domestically for the nation, for the country? So dependency theory, has not been able to articulate what this national economic interest should be. In theory sounds interesting. In theory sounds like a no-brainer, but especially now, defining what's, Bolivian or Mexican is very difficult. It's very difficult. Let me give you an example. So many of the cars that we buy today in the USA are coming from, say, Mexico. But if you think about the components of the car, they may be, the rubber may be coming from Brazil. The engine may be from Germany. Steel may be from Russia. So the car itself says made in Mexico, but is it really a Mexican produced car? Well, labor is Mexican for sure. So the definition of what a nation is very different from what it used to be centuries ago, right? So anyway, let me move on to number 5. Dependency theory argue that the elites in poor countries have this interest in maintaining the relationship with the interest of rich people in rich countries, because by doing so, they just keep, becoming richer and richer. And this, in part, could explain why, as I said before, Latin America is not the poorest continent in the world. Latin America is the place on Earth where you find the highest level of income and wealth inequality. And again, this began from the days of the colony, when, remember, the Spanish were dominating and the indigenous populations were not. Even after independence, remember, we talk about political transformation, but no economic change. So land ownership concentration remain intact. And since then, Latin America has seen really high levels of income and wealth inequality. So in a way, you can think of this, relationship, dependency relationship as voluntary. And I'm using these quotes because, in a way, is domestic leadership, the rich elite in poor countries forming alliances with rich people in rich countries on a voluntary basis because their interests coincide. Is that in the best interest of the country? Probably not, but that's not what these people in power have in mind. So, in that sense, it's a voluntary dependency relationship, right? We are going to talk about this note later, but there have been some cases where countries in the periphery have resisted the, influence by rich countries, either by repudiating multinational corporations, like trying to freeze assets or try to expel or in any way to avoid the interference of rich nations. And this behavior normally results in economic sanctions. So rich nations can impose sanctions. So don't sell medicine to these countries, don't sell food to these countries. And in some other cases, military invasion and control. And we are going to talk about a few examples later. But I don't want to deviate too much now. Instead, I want to talk about this. What are the policy implications? And this is going to be a nice introduction for what we are going to be covering next week, okay? Policy implication number 1. I already mentioned this, and you can read this later. But rich nations, the path the way they became rich, is not a good roadmap for poor countries to follow, right? For many, many reasons, some of which I already explained. But the point is that economic development is not a linear process. So we cannot just follow the blueprint that rich nations follow. That's one. Number two, this is important, guys. Dependency theory says the neoclassical mainstream market-based economic system doesn't work the way it's supposed to. This trickle-down effect, forget it. It may be something that you can see in homogeneous places where pretty much everybody starts from the same place, where there are not significant racial, ethnic, or gender biases. But these conditions typically are not the rule, are the exception. In most Latin American countries, actually in most countries around the world, you have these issues of racial divisions, ethnic divisions, gender biases, and as a consequence, you don't have this nice model in practice of trickle down, where the benefits are going to spread throughout the country and everybody's going to benefit, and it's the tide that is going to lift all boats. No, this is just not going to happen. Focusing on economic growth only is not going to be enough. We need to implement policies and regulations that can help the market, that can assist the market in the distribution mechanism, not just on the efficient part, but on the distribution of benefits part, right? Now, think about this. This resonates, I hope, closely with the traditional development economics. Remember, we talk about Amartya Sen, and when we talk about Gandhi and these guys a week ago, right? Anyway, here is another interesting element. Dependency theory, on the policy implications on dependency theory, number 3, they argue that you as a policymaker should not be only looking at a particular set of indicators that traditionally are used by, neoliberal policies like unemployment, GDP, interest rates, investment, the stock market. Yeah, all of these are good. All of these are important indicators. But if you really want to have a good thermometer, a good pulse on the health of the economy, these are not going to give you the whole picture. No way, no way. You need to add, in addition to these typically used traditional indicators, you need another set. You need to look at poverty rates, income distribution, access to education, access to water, access to health. You see, we're talking about a very different set of indicators that normally are out of the picture. So if you look at the news, even today, typically you see, let's go to, Bloomberg. What do they talk about? Unemployment, interest rate, GDP, the stock market. When have you heard these guys talk about, this particular state or this particular country is suffering because they don't have drinkable water? That's not important, right? Or they don't have electricity. Or guess what? The number of doctors per capita or the number of teachers per capita is like half of what it is in rich countries. You see the point? Dependency theory says you really need to emphasize to look at a alternative or at least supplementary set of indicators if you really want to have a good sense of what's going on in the economy, particularly when it comes to development and the distribution of wealth and the distribution of income. So if we don't want to emphasize economic growth only, you need this alternative set of indicators, right? Interesting stuff. And again, I'm just accumulating. I'm giving you a lot of tools that we are going to be using later, all right? And then number 4, once again, I am going to talk about the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, and other multilateral organizations later. But basically, they argue that these multilateral agencies have the interest of rich nations first and the interest of everybody else after, right? And later we're going to talk about how is that rich nations are able to very closely control these multilateral agencies. Essentially, it all comes to, normally you think on this metric. One country equals one vote, right? But that's not the way they work. In the IMF and the World Bank, for example, they use $1, one vote. So if a country is making a larger contribution to this organization, they don't get one vote. No, they get a number of votes proportional to the number of dollars they chip in. So think about this. It's not one country, one vote. If that was the case, it would be, at the table of negotiation, you would have Eritrea negotiating with the US or Bolivia negotiating with the UK 1-to-1. But that's not the way it works. You may have representatives of these countries, and at these negotiation tables, you have one per country. But at the end of the day, it's not about raising a hand and I vote for yay or nay. No, it's about who makes the larger contribution is the one that gets more votes when it comes to making decisions, right? Anyway, once again, this would be a good point to stop and ask if you have questions. I can do it. All right, let's talk about some criticisms. Later, we are going to discover, once we start looking into the actual implementation of these policies, because yes, oh yes, everything we have talked about was put in practice in real life in Latin America and in Asia as well. We are going to discover that in order to launch this type of policies, you need a very powerful agent, a very powerful economic entity that could inject the capital, that could organize, that could produce the policies and regulations and so forth. Well, guess what? That entity was the federal government, right? So in many cases in Latin America, the government took over industries, state-owned enterprises, right? And I'm going to tell you a lot of stories next week about the implications of this. But the point of this criticism is that, unfortunately, this practice produced a significant amount of corruption for reasons that we are going to explore later. The second element is that, remember, many of the dependency theories that we talk about speak about isolation from the rest of the world. And the more moderate ones propose that instead of cutting ties with everybody, all they needed to do was to protect, in this bubble of policies, domestic industries, to increase production, to make sure that these industries were growing up. And once they reach a mature age enough, they would open up to international competition. The problem was that many of these industries were overprotected. And just like when you overprotect a child, they never grow, they never develop these social skills. And once you ask them to go and look for a job or to go out on their own, they can't because they are not ready, right? So we're going to talk about this later, but at this point, this is enough. Two important criticisms that, eventually, as you will see, prove correct. Unfortunately, as appealing, at least to some of you, as these ideas may sound, the criticisms at the theoretical level prove correct at the practical level. So I'll give you some elements later. Here is additional points of dispute. So essentially, what this section is about is this. Dependency theory claims that this principle of comparative advantage breaks down because capital is highly mobile, especially during during the times of globalization. So remember, the comparative advantage principle that David Ricardo and Adam Smith explained, 2 centuries ago, we didn't have the sophistication of financial markets, transportation that we have today. So in the minds of dependency theory, they say, like I was explaining before, what does it mean that, Japan is trading with Mexico or that Chile is trading with Europe when they are so intertwined because of the multinational corporations, right? So dependency theory argues that this notion of comparative advantage is outdated. We'll come back to this one later. However, and this is the counter argument, the neoliberal, neoclassical economists argue that if you think about this, because now we have close to zero transportation cost and close to zero communication cost, which typically are 2 of the most seriously challenged assumptions in market activity. When thanks to globalizations, these criticisms are gone. So, this idea of a global marketplace, including comparative advantage, is more relevant now than ever, right? So you have these 2 competing arguments that comparative advantage and globalization is just going to, break down. And then neoliberals argue that it's quite the opposite, that it's going to actually gain strength. Well, we'll see. We'll see for the case of Latin America. Now, a couple of food for thoughts, since I'm running out of time already. This is my last chart. So food for thought number one, right here. Dependency theory was attacked, at least indirectly, if you think about this, by Fidel Castro when he was alive. Remember, Fidel Castro was in power as president of Cuba for decades, and you probably are familiar with the trade embargo, which basically meant that the US wouldn't allow American companies or international companies with ties to America, the US, to conduct transactions with Cuba. No medicine, no food, no resources for these guys, right? So the idea was to choke the Cuban economy, hoping that the population in Cuba was going to rebel and overthrow Fidel Castro. Well, that never happened, right? Until actually he died, and that didn't happen. Anyway, the point is that, when he was alive, Castro was blaming the US embargo, but, as one of the main reasons that Cuba was, suffering so much. But if dependency theory is right, the embargo, rather than causing harm to Cuba, should be producing benefits because, the trade embargo in a way is was keeping Cuba isolated from the US, right? Preventing the US from exploiting Cuba. I don't know if you understand this argument. I hope you do. But the point is that, all right, that doesn't make any sense. If dependency theory is right, Cuba would be a superstar by now because Cuba has not been exploited, extraction of resources, no. Multinational corporations, no. The US intervened, no. All of that was gone. So why is Cuba in such a bad place? Well, that's the criticism. That's the food for thought. What's going on? Which is tied to food for thought number 2. Dependency theory argue, at least some of these guys argue, that it's not necessarily capitalism the reason behind exploitation. All you need is some sort of relationship of dependency. So in the case of Cuba, it was not the US, it was not the Europeans, but perhaps it was the Soviet Union doing what, in dependency theory words, was doing what the US was doing in Costa Rica, or the British were doing in Venezuela. Well, the Soviets were doing exactly the same thing in Cuba. So it doesn't have to be a market-based, neoliberal, capitalist force behind the exploitation. All you need is a powerful force, a powerful entity capable of moving into another country, you know, periphery, center, and exploit it. Interesting food for thought here. Anyway, finally, let me finish with this. And again, this is an interesting introduction for next week. Vargas Llosa, let me make sure you bring your attention to this. Álvaro Vargas Llosa is the son of a Nobel Prize, Vargas Llosa, in literature, this guy from Peru. Anyway, he wrote a very famous book called The Return of the Idiot. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because all of these policies that took place in the 60s, the 70s, and so forth in Latin America, as we will see, didn't work very well. And for reasons that we are going to explore later, 30, 40 years later, in the 2000s and 2010s, they came back to Latin America. And this is why Vargas Llosa is talking about the return of the idiot, because in the mind of these analysts and many other people, places like Venezuela with Hugo Chavez or Correa and others in Latin America, they were trying to implement policies that have proven to be wrong 30, 40 years earlier. And they were going to try again. So, you know, some people thought of these, oh, what a bunch of idiots. So anyway, we are going to explore these things because, well, you know, I'm using pretty strong words and very superficial arguments. I realize that. We are going to dig deeper and deeper and deeper to fully understand why these policies didn't work in the first place in the 80s, and why, you know, 30, 40 years later, those policies came back. And what's happening now? I mean, this is 40 years later, you know? So this is where we are going to start talking about contemporary Latin America and other things. All right, let me stop sharing this because to end this, let me bring this up. Give me a second here. I'm looking for something. All right. I'm going to share my screen, and I want to bring this to your attention. So right now, you should be looking at the Canvas website, right? So you know this, the recorded lectures are here, you know, whatever, you know that. But the point I want to make right now is that under the reading list, and let me highlight this so that you understand very well what I'm talking about. Under the reading list on dependency theory, notice that in addition to the PDF files, now I am going to start putting some videos. These are YouTube videos of, you know, short clips, short documentaries. This one in particular, obviously, corresponds to dependency theory. So, you know, as part of the class today, make sure you watch it. It's like, you know, 5 or 6 minutes long. It's a well-done documentary made by PBS. Actually, the documentary is like 4 hours long, but this section deals with dependency theory in Latin America, and it's just 4, 5, 6 minutes. So make sure you watch it as part of the assignment for Friday, so that we can cover this section completely. All right, guys, I think it's pretty close to, I don't know, 47, 48 minutes. And I think that's good enough for today. I will see you again live on Monday. And if you have questions or comments, as always, please let me know via email or drop by during office hours. So bye, guys. I hope you have a nice weekend. I'm going to stop recording now.